All right, here we are for the 2025 Weed Out Coordinator Training, Part 3. And this video is specifically for the fall training, strategies for removal for the control of invasive species. And in fall, we focus on woody invasive species, mostly buckthorn, sometimes honeysuckle, as well as a few others. What we have to start off with right off the bat when we're discussing invasive species control is really coming up with a game plan to attack those invasive species. So this is going to start with designating a work area within your individual park. I'm happy to conduct a site visit with you to go ahead and discuss what's going to be the best area within your park, what's going to make the most impactful difference in your park ecologically speaking. I know that we have community members and friends groups who have specific interest in particular areas in their parks where they would be interested in removing invasive species. So I'm happy to discuss that with you, and we'll work out together what is going to be the best work site for you and your group and in your individual park. Big thing here is knowing that invasive species control, this is going to be a long-term action plan. This is not something that you can just go after species for 1 year. It's going to require multiple years of work to really go ahead and turn things around. So being aware of your limits, it's really easy. I'm guilty of wanting to do a whole lot all at once, and it's always better to start small. We have to temper our expectations a lot because that initial enthusiasm can pretty easily lead to overextension and burnout, and we want to avoid that. If you are interested, I can go ahead and share with you, create a map that looks like this one here to give you different target areas to work within your park, depending on the type of volunteer group that you might have for individual weed outs. Basically what this is these green star areas are going to be higher quality natural areas within the parks. They're going to have better native plant species, fewer invasive species. So these are the areas that you're going to want to have more experienced volunteers working in, maybe smaller groups, so that you have less trampling of good native plant species from heavy foot traffic, that sort of thing. On the flip side of that are the purple star areas. These are going to be the ones that have greater numbers, infestation of invasive species, fewer native species that could have a negative impact too if volunteers were to mistake ID, that sort of thing. So those are the areas that you can unleash larger volunteer groups into. I like including this slide in here because there is really a lot going on behind the scenes when we're determining which parts of the park and what kind of management we want to undertake. So you can see these first 4 bullet points. It's all talking about habitat and wildlife. So feel free to pause the video here and read some of the details here, but always coming up with a good game plan, thinking about plant life and wildlife in tandem. They're not separated. I think it's really easy for a lot of land managers just to focus on plant species and assuming, hey, we're removing these invasive species and it's going to have this great impact on wildlife, but we don't want to assume that, and we really want to think about the overall impact of our work. So all of this is going on in the background. But another thing, if you look at that 5th bullet point there, rapid response invasive species is something that our staff takes very seriously. So when our natural area staff is out there, let me back up a step. So rapid response species, what are these? They're not going to be your common buckthorn or your garlic mustard. These species are already very widespread in the habitat, and we're kind of always going to be in a maintenance kind of removal action plan for those because it's not feasible for us to completely eradicate those species from all of our parkland. Yes, we can have effective local control of them, but that's what we're looking at there. Rapid response invasives are the ones that we'll define as newer on the scene. They are not as well spread throughout the park system. They haven't got that same foothold. So these are ones that we want to go ahead and nip in the bud, so to speak, before they get to the level of our buckthorns and garlic mustards. And then the final bullet point there, it always comes back to what is going to be reasonable, feasible for your group? Can it be maintained? And realizing that a minimum time commitment of 3 years is going to be necessary. The sad fact of the matter is that 1 year of removing invasive species, if you did that in an area just for 1 year, they will come back with a vengeance. And sometimes that 1 year of work actually makes things worse than if you hadn't done anything at all, believe it or not. Timing and methods. So we are going into the fall season now. We focus on woody invasive species at this time of year. These charts have been created by people long before me that are very helpful for different species here, but you can see depending on the time of year, there's going to be a particular method of control that is going to be the most effective for control of these species. So you can see that these woody species, honeysuckle and common buckthorn, we do into late fall, into late summer, and into the fall season. These next two slides, I apologize, the resolution isn't that great, but I just wanted to have a look at the bigger picture here for invasive species control, how we tackle that. So you can see the infestation in that yellow circle there is really, really heavy, 100% cover of that hypothetical invasive species there. We recommend almost always that whenever you can, go ahead and tackle the outlying populations of invasive species where it's thinnest. This is going to be a lot more effective. There's likely going to be fewer seeds in the seed bank. So when you remove those areas, there's going to be less follow-up treatment, hopefully or ideally there. You can have a much better impact. There's likely going to be more native species that are persisting in those areas and can fill in with this minimal invasive species work. So it's always going to be our highest priority to maintain those higher quality natural areas right up front and then move our way into the thicker infestations. There are some examples I already touched on when it might make more sense to move into the more heavily infested areas. For instance, if you have a volunteer group of 30 to 50 people, you're probably going to work in those lower quality areas. And then this chart just kind of shows how invasive species can take over. Once you get to the right side of the curve there, this is the buckthorn level where it's only feasible to control buckthorn populations locally in a really targeted manner, because we can't go through and remove every buckthorn from our park system, from our parks. It's not possible. If you look at the left side of the curve, this earlier, before they've really taken off, this is the rapid response invasives that I was talking about, where eradication can be possible for some of these species, especially at a local level. So it's just doing whatever we can to prevent new emerging invasive species from becoming the next buckthorn. I'll spend a fair amount of time on these next two slides to really talk about ID. This is going to be critical, naturally, to be able to identify these invasive species from some of their lookalikes. So I will give you some key characteristics to look for our most common, starting off with common buckthorn. So looking at these pictures, I'll have you first off look at the right-hand side. Let's look at the leaf of a common buckthorn plant. If you look at those leaves, one of the best characteristics is looking at those veins within the leaf. So if you look at those veins, you can see that they really curve upward toward the tip of the leaf, going out from that central vein. A lot of our other plant species, they're not going to have that strong curvature like that, and they're going to go out more diagonally toward the leaf edge, more directly. So the curving of the leaf is huge there. We'll start looking at some more particular characteristics. See the edge of the leaf? It's not smooth. Those margins of the leaves have these fine serrations, these little teeth on there. That's something to keep an eye out for. Another thing, the name, buckthorn, still on that same photo to the right, if you see the bud there and you see that little thorn that's sticking out of there, that's where it gets the name from. Many of the branches will have that little thorn sticking out, but it's not there on all branches to be aware of. Now let's look at the photo to the left. Those are the fruits, the ripe fruits that are on the trees. buckthorn is a species that has separate male and female trees, so not all mature buckthorn will have fruits. Only the females will. The males will not. So this can help you identify the female ones at least. See those fruits, they're going to be this deep blue, almost black color when they're ripe, and that can really set them apart from other lookalike species that we have in the park system. And they come in those pretty tight clusters like that. Otherwise, buckthorn bark, it's going to have all of these lenticels, all of these spots on the bark for gas exchange is what those are. But once you get a better eye for that, that can help really distinguish the species. And the biggest thing is when you scrape a buckthorn that is not super small, you scrape that bark off, you're going to have this brighter orange color inside the bark that sets it apart from other lookalikes. Our native chokecherry, for instance, if you scrape that bark, it's going to be a greenish color, but for buckthorn, it's going to be a characteristic orange color. And now moving on to our second most common woody invasive species that volunteer removes, the hated honeysuckle. So we have many different species of invasive bush honeysuckle, but they all look pretty darn similar. Let's first off look at that top photo there. When you cut down an invasive honeysuckle, it's going to have a hole in the middle of it like that. So that's a really strong ID characteristic for this species. So after you cut it, you can see, okay, it's got that hole in there. I know I cut the right one. Next most characteristic, I would say, is looking at the bark and the structure. So honeysuckle, it's this bush species, it's this shrub. It's going to have multiple branches coming off, so not a typical single trunk like our trees have. So it's going to have multiple branches coming off like that, multiple trunks, and it's going to have this bark that is peely, especially the older it gets a little flaky, and the color is going to be pretty light. It's going to be this tannish light brown color. If we look at the leaves, they're going to be kind of basic looking, but if you look at the attachment, they're going to be directly opposite each other on the stem. So for basic plant ID, one of the first questions we ask ourselves is, are the leaves on a branch directly opposite one another, or are they alternating on that branch? And for honeysuckle, it's opposite. Otherwise, the leaves are pretty generic looking. They're kind of oval shaped. They'll come to a point a little bit, but I really say that bark and that hole in the middle of the stem are going to be the easiest traits to be able to identify. Otherwise, the berries, there's going to be different colored berries depending on species, but some of them are this kind of reddish orange color. Some of them are more of an intense orange, but they'll come in these little round berry clusters. And the flowers, looking at that right-hand side photo, are certainly characteristic of honeysuckle. So they could be pink, they could be white, they could be yellow. There's a lot of different colors, but that shape is characteristic. They have a subtle, sweet fragrance to them. So that can be another way to identify them in spring when they're flowering in May and June. Otherwise, for timing of methods for treating these, pretty much for all of our woody invasive species, we're going to use the same type of treatment. So anytime, as I said before, from basically July through March, you can do this cut stump treatment. So this is where you'll take a handsaw or a pair of loppers and you'll cut these plants, all the stems, really close to the base. You're going to want to cut them level with the ground if possible. You don't want something at a 45-degree angle that is going to be sharp. If you step on that, be a really unpleasant experience. So cutting them flush to the ground. And you'll want to treat those stems with the herbicide. I know herbicide's not everybody's favorite. This is actually my favorite application method though, because it is completely targeted. You're not going to have any off-target spray damage kind of thing. So it is really targeted there, and it's necessary because all of these plant species, if you cut them, they're just able to resprout. So where there was one stem, there's going to be 5 or 10 stems, and you get this Hydra problem from Greek mythology, right? So we don't want that, and that's why we use the herbicide. If for smaller plants, you are able to just pull up the whole plant, roots and all. So this is something that can be done any time of year, basically except for when the ground's frozen. So you can do hand pulling, or you can use a tool called a weed wrench, which I've got a slide coming up to show that in a little bit. But that can be done any time of year if you're getting the roots. So those are the two main species I decided to go into for this presentation, the buckthorn and the honeysuckle. I did create and put together some guides that were already created for identifying these common invasive species in our park system that your friends groups might encounter. So please click on this link. I can have I'll send out a PDF version too if you reach out to me, so you can click on that link easily and be able to tell, hey, this is common buckthorn versus glossy buckthorn versus the native common or the native chokecherry or native black cherry. So we want to make sure that we're leaving those natives to not have that negative harm, but then to also fill in naturally once we remove these invasives. I've got some other species like tree of heaven versus other lookalikes. I got honeysuckle versus we do have native honeysuckle that's abundantly common locally in some of our parks. So please check out those ID guides there. All right, the cut stump treatment. So making sure we have the right tool for the job is huge. And I've got a slide to show you these, but if they're pencil width or smaller, those are ones that can be hand pulled pretty readily. Otherwise, you can use the weed wrench that I'm talking about, 1 to 2 inches, maybe a little bit bigger. You could use with this tool. It's a vise-like lever action tool, basically, that you can get larger ones than you could do with your own brute force with your own hands. Otherwise, loppers, we recommend, depending on the size of the loppers, maybe 1 to 2 inches in diameter. Ultimately, I think sound is a good way to tell if, you know, you're straining to get the loppers through, and if there's any kind of squeaking, you know that that is bad for the tool, and this is not the right tool for the job if it's too big. So if it ends up being more than that inch or 2 inch marker, that's when you get into handsaw territory. Cutting the stumps as low to the ground as possible is crucial for a couple reasons. We don't want these tripping hazards, and we want to make sure that the herbicide is going to be effectively taken up by the roots. If you leave too much material of the stem above ground, the herbicide isn't going to be able to penetrate and translocate to those roots below ground. So generally 2 inches is what we ask. I understand if you're cutting down some sizable larger trees, maybe it ends up being 4 inches above ground or a little bit higher, and that's fine, just making sure that you apply enough herbicide to those stumps. Then after you've cut this vegetation, you got to decide what to do with it, right? So placing the brush in appropriate piles is going to be the recommended course of action for just about every friends group. I'll talk about that coming up in a minute. And then, like I said, applying the herbicide to those stumps. And what's going to be critical here is making sure that your volunteers have moved out of that area so that you are not exposing anybody to some, potential herbicide getting on them. So brush piles in natural areas. These can be first off, they're extremely beneficial to a lot of our native wildlife. We see birds, sparrows especially, make really good use of this habitat. We see small mammals using it. So we have these brush piles on site, and people think, oh, why do you want all of that woody debris there? But it's really beneficial for wildlife, I like to say off the bat. It's nice that we can leave all of this cut vegetation on site too, so that we don't have to expend the resources to remove it from the landscape, especially when we don't really have the resources and capability to be removing it from site. So what we want to do for these brush piles, we'll tuck them away as tidily as we can in a natural area. So we'll be making sure that we keep them further back in the natural areas, not close to a trail, not close to a waterway. We don't want to be putting these brush piles on soil that's going to be wet for any part of the year, standing water, because if you've heard, buckthorn has a chemical called emodin, which basically it can wage chemical warfare on other plants. So it gives buckthorn an advantage against plant species that are growing towards it, but scientists have shown that that chemical can have negative impacts on the metamorphosis of our amphibians, so we don't want that chemical breaking down and getting into our waterways, that sort of thing. So not in those wet areas. We also, there's a lot of rules here, but we also want to try to build them taller than they are wide. And the idea here is they actually break down surprisingly fast. Our staff will build 10-foot brush piles, and in a year or two, they will be half that size in height. So they do break down surprisingly fast. And we want to build them higher over wide so that we're not covering a bunch of this soil that we've now cleared out, because we want native species to go ahead and come back in there. And they're going to have a lot more trouble growing in there with covered up by brush piles if they're too sprawled out. When you're piling these brush piles, keeping them tidy and keeping all the stems in one direction, or 180 degrees in the opposite way, it just makes the brush piles easier to maintain. If you can have somebody carefully push down the pile or carefully hop on top of the pile just to condense it, they really do smush down, and you can get a lot more branches onto those piles. Otherwise, making sure that it's not on mowed turf is a big thing. So like I said, natural areas, mowed turf is not natural areas. We don't want to get in the way of operations of unit staff. We also asked not to put them right next to large trees. We don't want that tree having to, grow around the brush pile if it's right next to it, having any damage to that bark, but also on the off chance that a brush pile were to catch fire, and the only way that's going to happen is if a human were to do it, quite honestly, but we don't want that brush pile to be burned and then the tree to suffer because of that. Finally, being aware of what area we're putting the brush pile on. You might be working in a high quality area where there's a lot of native plants, so please reach out to me and I can let you know if there are any rare native plants that we have mapped within your park so that we're not placing the brush pile right on top of them and jeopardizing those. There are some occasions where it may be possible for forestry to come and pick up your brush piles. I will say right off the bat that this is not something that happens in most instances. We have limited capabilities of doing this, and usually tucking these piles away in the natural areas works just fine. One instance that I can think where it might be possible for this is if you have an extremely narrow natural area and you don't have anywhere to put these brush piles, then we can go ahead and see if we can work with fellow park staff and reach out and see if picking up of these brush piles is an option. The big thing here is please communicate with me, and we need this prior approval. We can't just set out the brush piles and wish for the best. So I won't go into all the details there, but then we've got specific details for how to pile this brush to get it picked up in a timely manner. Some more pictures, evidence right here of brush piles. That one on the left-hand side is looking great. The one on the right-hand side, those small piles could have been combined a little bit and not placed right next to those poles, because if these piles do get picked up, they have some kind of claw tool off their truck that they can pick them up. And having infrastructure there like trees or poles would get in the way of that potentially. Big reminder here, I already said trying to cut the stumps as low to the ground as possible is going to be important. All of these stumps are way too high. The herbicide, if there was herbicide applied, is not going to be effective at this stage. And you can see some of those resprouts just really coming out. So like I said, where there was one, now there are many, many more. We've had a lot of new friends groups that have popped up in this last year and the last couple of years. So I wanted kind of a summary slide that I hope will streamline things a little bit. So you're a new friends group, you're interested in the Weed Out program. What are the steps here in general? So attending this training, the fact that you're watching this, thank you. Perfect first step. After that, please reach out to me, send me an email. I have my contact information at the end of these presentations. So please reach out to me and we can meet on site and discuss your local natural area and come up with a plan. Otherwise, the next step, reaching out to the park people who provide the supplies and the tools and the pesticide, reaching out to them with enough advance notice before your event so that you can get all of that. If your group is doing woody invasive species removal where you're cutting these species, then it is going to be necessary that a minimum of one member of your group has this pesticide applicator certification through DETCAP. We asked that you all get the 6.0, which is natural areas and right-of-ways. I'll talk about that coming up in a little bit, but then reporting all of those numbers, it's going to be for any herbicide, that's state law. We need to keep track of all of these numbers, but also all of this information, providing us with volunteer numbers and all of that data is very important to keep track of and can help us with funding and grant writing and all of that kind of stuff. All right, very text-filled slide here, but a little bit more about herbicide. What is all included in that? Like I said, having at least one member from your group who will be present for the weed out to apply that pesticide, that herbicide. It's going to be necessary to have this 6.0, so you can follow that link there. A big thing too, which I haven't mentioned yet, is when you are applying the pesticide, I already said that having volunteers move out of that area before you do it, so you're probably not applying that pesticide until maybe an hour or two into the weed out. But putting up those warning, those pesticide signs, those white with the red text on there before is going to be really important. There's a link toward the bottom on the right for the electronic form to fill out for the herbicide numbers and the volunteer numbers. Some more information about herbicide storage. One thing focusing on the last bullet point is that herbicide does have a shelf life, and it may be necessary if you feel that if you've been holding on to your herbicide for a while, especially more than a year or two, we might need to get it back over to Ken Solis to have him get you some new herbicide to make sure it is effective. With that, please look at the next video, part 4 for removal to restoration. Thank you very much.